Commercial aviation is designed around limits, and those limits exist for a reason. Every aircraft has a defined envelope that governs how fast it can fly, how high it can climb, and how much stress its structure can endure. Pilots are trained to respect these boundaries because beyond them, an airplane stops behaving like an airplane. On a clear February day in 1985, one wide-body passenger jet crossed those boundaries so dramatically that decades later the event would be misremembered as a plane that accidentally flew into space. The aircraft was a Boeing 747 SP, a shortened, long-range variant of the iconic jumbo jet. It was built to fly higher and farther than most airliners of its time, cruising comfortably above weather systems and carrying passengers across oceans without refueling. On paper, it was one of the most capable commercial aircraft ever produced. On this flight, it would be pushed far beyond what any airline intended. The journey began routinely. The aircraft departed Taipei on an international route, carrying a full load of passengers and crew. Weather along the planned track was mostly benign, with only light turbulence forecast at cruising altitude. The crew climbed the aircraft to its assigned level and engaged the autopilot, allowing the jet to settle into steady cruise. Nothing about the early phase of the flight suggested that it would become one of the most extreme altitude excursions in commercial aviation history. Gradually, a subtle problem emerged. One of the four engines began to lose thrust. The change was not violent or obvious. Instead, it presented as a slow decay in performance that blended into normal cruise variations. The autopilot compensated automatically, trimming control surfaces and adjusting power on the remaining engines to maintain altitude and heading. To the system, the problem was manageable. To the aircraft, it was the beginning of a dangerous imbalance. As the weakened engine produced less thrust, the autopilot continued to command nose-up inputs to hold altitude. This increased the aircraft's angle of attack, reducing its margin above stall speed. At high altitude, that margin is already razor-thin. Air is less dense, engines produce less power, and aerodynamic efficiency drops sharply. The Boeing 747 SP was now flying closer and closer to the edge of its performance envelope, without any dramatic warning to those on board. Eventually, the compromised engine failed completely. The sudden loss of thrust forced the autopilot into an aggressive response. Instead of lowering the nose to regain airspeed, the system attempted to preserve altitude by pitching the aircraft upward. This reaction pushed the jet into a region where lift began to break down. The airspeed decayed rapidly, and the aircraft entered a deep aerodynamic stall. What followed defied every expectation of normal airline flight. As lift collapsed, the aircraft's nose pitched sharply upward, and the jet began climbing uncontrollably. Passengers were pressed into their seats as vertical acceleration increased. Loose objects floated. The sensation inside the cabin resembled weightlessness, a feeling more commonly associated with spacecraft than airliners. Instruments in the cockpit recorded a climb far beyond certified limits. The Boeing 747 SP surged upward to an altitude exceeding 40,000 feet, then continued climbing. At its peak, the aircraft reached an altitude estimated above 41,000 feet, possibly higher during the transient climb. While this was nowhere near the boundary of outer space, it was dangerously close to the absolute ceiling at which a fully loaded passenger jet could sustain controlled flight. The margin between controlled aerodynamics and the vacuum of the upper atmosphere had nearly vanished. At that height, the aircraft was no longer truly flying. It was following a ballistic arc, trading airspeed for altitude as lift became ineffective. Control inputs had limited effect. The engines, starved of oxygen, could not respond normally. For a brief period, the aircraft existed in a regime where aviation textbooks offer few comforting assurances. It was neither cruising nor climbing by design. It was falling upward before gravity reclaimed it. As airspeed decayed to critically low values, the nose finally dropped. The aircraft rolled violently, entering a steep dive. Structural loads built rapidly as the jet accelerated downward. The forces experienced during this descent exceeded what passengers ever encounter in routine flight. Yet the airframe held together, absorbing stresses far beyond those seen in service. During the dive, the aircraft lost tens of thousands of feet of altitude in minutes. The recovery required decisive control inputs and careful management of the remaining engines. Gradually, the crew regained controlled flight at lower altitude, where denser air restored aerodynamic authority. The immediate crisis passed, but the aircraft and everyone aboard had survived something unprecedented. When the jet landed safely, the incident entered aviation history as one of the most extreme high-altitude upsets ever experienced by a commercial airliner. Over time, simplified retellings transformed the event into a dramatic myth, a passenger plane that flew into space. The truth was more nuanced and more instructive. The aircraft never crossed the boundary into space, but it came close enough to reveal how thin the line can be between controlled flight and catastrophe. This incident reshaped pilot training, automation philosophy, and understanding of high-altitude aerodynamics. It demonstrated that technology designed to reduce workload could, under specific conditions, push an aircraft into danger if not carefully monitored. Above all, it proved that even the most advanced airliners remain bound by physics, and that exceeding those limits carries consequences no autopilot can fully prevent after control was partially regained. The aircraft was still far from safety. The violent descent had saved it from the thin upper atmosphere, but it had also introduced a new set of risks. High-speed dives place enormous stress on airframes, especially on wide-body aircraft designed for smooth, steady cruise rather than abrupt altitude changes. Inside the cabin, passengers struggled to understand what had happened. Fear lingered not because of what they could see, but because of what they had felt. In the cockpit, the crew now faced a complex and evolving situation. One engine was completely inoperative, another had suffered damage during the upset, and multiple systems were reporting faults triggered by extreme attitudes and overspeed conditions. The aircraft was flyable, but it was no longer operating within normal parameters. Every control input had to be deliberate, measured, and informed by incomplete data. High-altitude stalls were not well understood in commercial aviation at the time. Training focused heavily on low-altitude stall recovery, where increasing thrust and lowering the nose reliably restored lift. At cruise altitude, the physics were different. Power increases could worsen the situation, pitch changes had delayed effects, and the margin between overspeed and stall was perilously narrow. The crew had experienced this reality firsthand in a way few pilots ever would. As the aircraft stabilized at a lower altitude, the immediate threat of aerodynamic loss subsided. Denser air restored control responsiveness, and engine performance improved. Even so, the flight remained abnormal. Vibrations from the damaged airframe persisted, and warnings intermittently flashed as systems recalibrated. The decision was made to divert rather than continue to the original destination. Safety now depended on caution rather than ambition. While the crew managed the aircraft, unseen processes were unfolding elsewhere. Data recorders captured thousands of parameters per second, documenting every second of the climb, stall, and dive. These records would later become essential evidence for investigators trying to understand how a modern airliner could be driven so close to its absolute limits without an obvious external trigger like severe weather or sabotage. When the aircraft finally touched down, the relief was immediate and overwhelming. Emergency services surrounded the jet, prepared for the possibility of structural failure or fire. None came. The airplane had survived, and so had everyone on board. Yet survival did not mean the danger had passed. The real work was only beginning. Investigators soon focused on the interaction between automation and human oversight. The autopilot had done exactly what it was designed to do: maintain altitude. It had no contextual understanding of engine degradation or the narrowing performance margin at high altitude. As thrust decreased, it compensated with pitch, slowly and persistently eroding airspeed. The system did not perceive danger until it was too late, and even then, its responses were constrained by the logic built into it. The crew, meanwhile, had not immediately recognized the severity of the situation. Engine failures at cruise altitude are rare but usually manageable. What made this case unique was the subtlety of the initial failure and the way automation masked its consequences. By the time the full loss of thrust occurred, the aircraft was already positioned precariously close to stall. The investigation revealed another critical factor. High-altitude flight leaves little room for error. At those heights, the difference between maximum operating speed and stall speed shrinks dramatically, forming what pilots call the coffin corner. Within this narrow band, even small deviations in pitch or thrust can produce large and dangerous consequences. The aircraft had unknowingly drifted into this region, guided there by systems designed to keep it stable. Public understanding of the incident quickly diverged from technical reality. Headlines simplified the story, emphasizing altitude numbers without context. As retellings spread, the narrative grew more dramatic. The idea of a passenger jet nearly reaching space captured imaginations, even though space itself remained far beyond the aircraft's reach. The myth endured because it expressed a deeper truth. The flight had crossed into a realm where normal rules seemed suspended. For the aviation industry, the incident became a catalyst for change. Training programs were revised to emphasize high-altitude aerodynamics and automation management. Pilots were taught to recognize subtle signs of energy loss and to distrust automation when performance margins narrowed. Manufacturers reevaluated autopilot logic, introducing safeguards that would reduce pitch authority in low-energy states. The aircraft itself never returned to service. Structural inspections revealed stresses that exceeded design assumptions. While the airframe had held together, it had done so at the cost of its future. Retiring the aircraft was not a failure. It was an acknowledgement that survival alone does not guarantee continued safety. Over time, the incident faded from mainstream awareness, replaced by newer events and technologies. Yet within aviation circles, it remained a reference point, a reminder of how advanced machines can still be undone by the interaction of small failures. It demonstrated that danger does not always arrive suddenly. Sometimes it creeps in quietly, masked by systems meant to help. The idea that the plane flew into space persists because it conveys the emotional truth of the experience. For those on board, the sensation of climbing beyond expectation, of gravity loosening its grip, felt unreal. The sky became unfamiliar, almost hostile. In that moment, the aircraft did not feel like it belonged to Earth at all. But the reality was more sobering. The flight did not escape Earth's atmosphere. It did something more instructive. It revealed how close the boundaries of safe flight truly are, and how easily they can be crossed when humans and machines misunderstand each other. In that lesson lies the true legacy of the flight that climbed too high. To understand why the aircraft came so close to disaster, investigators turned to the environment in which the incident unfolded. High-altitude flight is fundamentally different from flight closer to the ground. Air density drops sharply with altitude, reducing lift and engine efficiency at the same time. An aircraft must fly faster to generate the same lift, yet it cannot exceed structural or aerodynamic speed limits. This contradiction creates a narrow corridor where safe flight is possible. This corridor is known among pilots as the coffin corner. At lower altitudes, it barely exists. At cruising heights above 35,000 feet, it becomes a defining constraint. The margin between stall speed and maximum operating speed can shrink to just a few knots. Within this space, even minor disturbances can have outsized effects. A small pitch change, a slight loss of thrust, or an unnoticed system bias can push an aircraft beyond recoverable limits. The Boeing 747 SB was certified to operate near this region more than most airliners. Its shortened fuselage and powerful engines allowed it to climb higher than standard variants. However, certification assumes ideal conditions and fully functioning systems. The moment an engine began losing thrust, those assumptions quietly unraveled. The aircraft's energy state deteriorated while outward signs remained subtle. Automation played a central role in this erosion. The autopilot's mandate was simple: hold altitude. It had no conceptual awareness of coffin corner or diminishing energy reserves. As thrust decreased, it compensated by commanding a higher angle of attack. This maintained altitude temporarily but consumed airspeed. Each adjustment appeared reasonable in isolation, yet together they formed a path toward instability. The crew's situational awareness was further challenged by the nature of high-altitude cues. Near sea level, stalls are often preceded by buffet, vibration, and obvious control changes. At extreme altitude, these warnings can be muted or absent. The aircraft can transition from stable flight to stall with little physical feedback. Instruments become the primary source of truth, and even they can lag behind the unfolding reality. When the final engine failure occurred, the aircraft crossed a threshold. Lift degraded faster than the autopilot could compensate. Instead of reducing pitch to regain airspeed, the system continued to prioritize altitude. This response was not irrational, it was logical within its programming. Yet logic without context can be dangerous. The result was a deep stall at an altitude where recovery options were limited. As the aircraft climbed uncontrollably, the airflow over its wings became increasingly ineffective. Control surfaces lost authority. The aircraft's trajectory became governed less by pilot input and more by momentum and gravity. In this state, traditional concepts of flying ceased to apply. The aircraft was no longer sustained by lift in the conventional sense. It was transitioning between flight and free fall. Investigators later described this phase as a zoom climb, a maneuver where kinetic energy is converted into altitude. Military aircraft perform such climbs intentionally under controlled conditions. A fully loaded passenger jet does not. The climb was brief, dramatic, and deceptive. To an observer, it might have looked like a triumph of performance. In reality, it was a sign of imminent loss of control. The subsequent dive was equally perilous. As the nose dropped and airspeed increased, the aircraft re-entered denser air at a steep angle. Forces built rapidly. Wings flexed, control surfaces strained, and the structure absorbed loads far beyond those encountered in service. Overspeed warnings sounded as the aircraft accelerated toward its limits. Recovery required threading the needle between structural failure and renewed stall. That the aircraft survived this phase was a testament to conservative engineering. Commercial airliners are built with safety margins that account for rare but extreme events. Those margins were tested here. The aircraft emerged damaged but intact, its structure permanently altered yet unbroken. Beyond the technical analysis, investigators examined human factors. Fatigue, workload, and trust in automation all shaped the crew's response. Automation had reduced workload for decades, conditioning pilots to rely on it during routine phases of flight. When it subtly led the aircraft toward danger, that trust became a vulnerability. The incident highlighted the need for pilots to actively monitor energy state rather than assume systems would protect it. The findings reverberated through training programs worldwide. High-altitude stall recovery became a formalized topic rather than a theoretical footnote. Pilots were taught that altitude is expendable, but airspeed is life. Letting the aircraft descend is often the only viable response to energy loss at cruise altitude. This principle, simple in hindsight, was not universally emphasized before the incident. The story also challenged public perceptions of aviation safety. The idea that a passenger plane could wander so close to its limits unsettled many. Yet the deeper lesson was reassuring. The system worked, not perfectly, but sufficiently. Layers of safety, engineering margins, and human intervention combined to prevent catastrophe even when events unfolded at the edge of the envelope. Over time, the incident became less about a plane climbing too high and more about understanding boundaries. It showed that flight is not defined by altitude alone, but by energy, balance, and awareness. Crossing into unfamiliar regimes does not require malice or recklessness. Sometimes it begins with a quiet failure and a system doing exactly what it was told to do. In this light, the myth of a plane flying into space misses the point. The aircraft did not challenge the cosmos. It challenged assumptions. It exposed how thin the margin can be between routine cruise and loss of control, and how vital it is to respect the invisible lines that keep aircraft safely in the sky long after the aircraft had landed and the passengers had returned to ordinary life. The flight continued to shape aviation in quieter ways. Its legacy was not written in headlines, but in manuals, simulators, and revised assumptions about how humans and machines share control. The incident forced the industry to confront an uncomfortable truth. Modern aircraft could still surprise those who flew them. Investigators reconstructed the event frame by frame, transforming raw data into understanding. Every control input, engine parameter, and attitude change was analyzed. The goal was not to assign blame, but to identify vulnerabilities. What emerged was a picture of a system that failed not because of one dramatic error, but because of several small, reasonable actions aligning in an unexpected way. One of the most significant outcomes was a shift in how automation was viewed. Before the incident, automation was widely regarded as a safeguard against human error. It reduced workload, increased precision, and enhanced consistency. Afterward, it was increasingly seen as a partner that required supervision. Automation could optimize, but it could not judge context. It could follow rules, but it could not sense danger beyond its programming. This change in philosophy influenced aircraft design. Newer systems were developed to monitor energy state more holistically, warning crews when margins narrowed dangerously. Autopilot logic was refined to avoid excessive pitch commands in low-energy situations. Alerts became clearer, prioritizing actionable information over sheer volume. The goal was not to remove automation, but to make its behavior more transparent and predictable. Pilot training evolved alongside technology. High-altitude aerodynamics, once treated as an advanced or niche topic, became standard curriculum. Simulators recreated scenarios where altitude had to be sacrificed to regain control. Pilots learned to recognize that maintaining level flight is not always the safest option. Descending early and decisively could prevent far worse outcomes. The incident also influenced how crews communicated. Energy management became a shared responsibility, discussed openly rather than assumed. Monitoring airspeed trends, thrust settings, and pitch attitude became an active process. Silence in the cockpit was no longer equated with stability. Instead, it was seen as a prompt to verify that systems were behaving as expected. Outside the cockpit, the story took on a different life. Simplified accounts circulated, emphasizing the dramatic climb and the sensation of weightlessness. Over time, nuance was lost. The phrase "flew into space" entered popular culture, not as a technical claim, but as a metaphor. It captured the idea of crossing into the unknown, of a routine journey suddenly defying expectation. This mythologizing was not entirely negative. It sparked curiosity about how airplanes fly and where the limits truly lie. It prompted questions about the boundary between atmosphere and space, about why airliners cruise where they do, and about what happens when those norms are disrupted. In this way, the story bridged the gap between technical reality and public imagination. Yet the true lesson lay deeper. The flight demonstrated that safety is not a static achievement, but an ongoing process. Each new technology introduces new interactions, some beneficial, others unforeseen. Mastery requires constant learning and humility. The sky may appear empty and forgiving, but it offers little margin for misunderstanding. The aircraft involved became a silent teacher. Though it never flew again, its data lived on. Engineers, instructors, and pilots studied its final flight as a case study in complexity. It reminded them that even rare events deserve attention, because rarity does not equal impossibility. The margins that protect flight can be thinner than they appear. In hindsight, the outcome was remarkably positive. No lives were lost, the aircraft was recovered, knowledge was gained. Aviation emerged stronger for having confronted a scenario it had not fully anticipated. This is how safety advances, not through perfection, but through reflection after imperfection. The idea of a passenger plane brushing the edge of space endures because it resonates emotionally. Space represents the ultimate boundary, a realm where familiar rules no longer apply. The flight felt like a brush with that boundary, even if it never truly crossed it. For those on board, the sensation of leaving normal flight behind was real, regardless of altitude figures. In reality, the aircraft remained firmly within Earth's domain. What it briefly escaped was predictability. It entered a region where training, technology, and instinct had to be reconciled in real time. That reconciliation succeeded not flawlessly, but sufficiently. Today's airliners are quieter, more efficient, and more automated than ever. They benefit from lessons learned through incidents like this one. Passengers rarely consider how close each flight operates to invisible limits, or how carefully those limits are managed. That ignorance is a measure of success. Safety works best when it goes unnoticed. The flight that climbed too high did not change aviation overnight. Instead, it contributed to a gradual evolution, shaping attitudes and systems in subtle ways. Its story is not one of failure, but of resilience. It shows how a complex system can bend without breaking, and how understanding grows from moments when certainty disappears. In the end, the aircraft did not fly into space. It did something more important. It revealed how far commercial aviation had come, and how carefully it must continue to move forward, always aware of the thin air that separates routine flight from the edge of control.